Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of COWTOWN Movie Classics, and welcome to the second installment in our Hammer Horror Week here at downtown COWTOWN at the ISIS. Tonight's film is one of my favorite horror films ever made, but it's certainly my favorite werewolf movie ever made. From 1961, it's The Curse of the Werewolf, from Hammer Films, directed by Terence Fisher. Joining me tonight, we have the pleasure of welcoming esteemed author, film historian, audio commentator, Mr. Lee Gambin. How are you doing tonight, Lee?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
The other side of the globe.
Yes, thanks for joining us. So where are you based?
In Melbourne, so south.
South Australia. Wow.
Yeah.
So Curse of the Werewolf came out in 1961, and at this point, Hammer was famous for having a successful string of full Technicolor remakes of these classic Gothic horror films. At this point, they had already done a couple of adaptations of Frankenstein, of course, their famous Horror of Dracula with Christopher Lee, The Mummy, teaming up Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. So where was Hammer at this point in 1961?
I feel like still kind of finding their feet, still
Yeah.
kind of getting that thing happening, that sort of building their repertoire of these sort of classic Gothic retellings, as you mentioned, with this beautiful full Technicolor, gorgeous, lavish designs and really beautiful art direction and cinematography, and just sort of reworking and retweaking these classic stories. So when you get to something like Werewolf, Curse of the Werewolf, it's kind of using text that sort of, has already been established, but also altering things and changing things, as they did with Curse of Frankenstein and, the Dracula films as well. But I think what they do is add their own sort of distinct Hammer charm. And I feel like Curse of the Werewolf is one that kind of sits quite in between a place of classical sort of Hammer, what we kind of know and love about Hammer, and then what's about to come later in the 70s. It's kind of a really interesting, grim, gritty film. Like, that film is loaded with this perversion, this gleeful perversion that I think is wonderful throughout the movie. And it's incredibly confronting. Like, you've got things such as, like, the Marquis picking scabs off himself. There's rape. There's, this whole concept of the denial of God. There's all this sort of, the fear of the unknown and the outsider being kind of positioned in a situation where he has to fight against his fate, which is stuff that pops up in a lot of horror works. But there's something so gleefully grim and perverse about Curse of the Werewolf, which I really like. I really think it's quite a confronting, fun film. That prologue that goes, that takes up most of the first act is just beautiful storytelling, like really clearly defined with the narration, and it goes through the gamut of all these emotions. You have Yvonne Romaine's performance as a mute woman, just so striking and so incredible and so visually captivating throughout. And then the whole thing about Christmas, which is an old tradition with werewolves, the idea of if you're born on Christmas and you're not in a wedlock baby, you will be doomed to become this lycanthrope. And also the transition stuff, like when Oliver Reed goes through his transitions and his guilt and his fear of himself, is all wonderfully played out by Oliver Reed, his first role. Yeah, just a really beautiful performance from him. Just the idea of this hedonistic sort of world that he lives in, like him and his friend who just sort of, want to get drunk and pick up, local sex workers. It's just a really, really engaging film. I think the plot just moves forward so strongly. I feel like sometimes a lot of Hammer films, when I was a kid, I used to tune out when it was like, too many men chatting for ages, like even though, it would be the likes of wonderful stars who, as you get older, revere, like Peter Cushing's and stuff, but just science sort of based ones, or men just talking for too long. It's like, oh my God, bring on the monster. And as you mentioned just before we recorded this, there is little screen time of Oliver Reed in his beautiful werewolf getup, but when he does appear, it's really fun. It's really cool. It's kind of designed like a timber wolf, his design, which is really interesting. And then also just that kind of sexiness to him. Like, there's a sort of romantic quality, as in, like, classicist romanticism with the puppy shirt, with his chest sort of showing and those black pants, etc. But it's kind of making it sort of this sort of the sexuality of the werewolf really popping up. And that's a big deal, I think, because it gets tapped on with other previous werewolf movies, but not so much as what we get here. With Curse of the Werewolf. So there's all these kind of really interesting sort of takes on the werewolf culture and mythology. And I think Curse of the Werewolf, what it does beautifully is takes Werewolf of Paris as a source material, obviously changes it to Spain because initially that set, the Spanish set, was made for some other film, a Inquisition-themed film that Hammer dropped. They shelved it. So they didn't change anything. They couldn't afford to change the set. So they just kept it as Madrid, or just in a Spanish village.
I'm glad you brought up The Werewolf of Paris. I have this paperback copy that I got a few years ago. I love this old pulp cover art.
Oh, how nice is that? But yeah, no, every aspect of that movie is beautiful. It looks beautiful. The music's terrific, and the design is great, and the performances are wonderful. But yeah, what I think distinctly makes it so unique about where it sits in its placement of Hammer is it's kind of a precursor to things to come, because Hammer goes hard. Like Hammer, you've got your lesbian vampire stuff. You've got all this stuff that comes later where it's like, oh my God, this is like, full on stuff, which is wonderful. But Curse kind of leads to that. Curse is like a precursor to that, because it is, as I said, like this gleefully, unapologetically perverse film.
Well, Lee, thank you so much for your time. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, directed by Terence Fisher, from 1961, The Curse of the Werewolf. I don't care what anyone says. That is still my favorite werewolf movie of all time.
It's a good one. It's a good one. And it's interesting because the 60s was kind of dominated with a lot of Mexican-themed werewolf films. That was a big go-to. But the 60s has really interesting werewolf stuff. But it's funny because this one comes out of, what was happening in the 50s, where you have kind of the atomic age monster movies really taking over. And the werewolf sort of entries in the 50s were quite fascinating and very different and diverse. You had things like I Was a Teenage Werewolf, which really comments on the teenage market and how teenagers are scary. And that if they're uncontrolled, they can do wild things, but also the idea of adults who want to sort of pervert young people, and you get that in How to Make a Monster and stuff like that. But also at the same time, you have Columbia giving us The Werewolf, which is like, I guess, the first sort of atomic age werewolf movie, like literally atomic age werewolf, where he's caused his werewolf, his lycanthropy is caused by nuclear matter. Which is a wonderful film, a beautiful film. Stephen Rich plays the lead in that, and really powerful, sad performance as a guy who's kind of detached from his wife and child, estranged from them, notably because of, he's a werewolf. But yeah, so the 50s is really interesting. And then you come into this early 60s thing with England delivering Curse of the Werewolf, and it's this full color, you have this wonderful prologue, this wonderful story, the way it sort of goes through the motions of this beautiful fairy tale-esque tale. And then, of course, once again, this tragic ending. So, the werewolf always cops the most tragic of endings, because you get to know werewolves a bit more than what you get to know your Frankenstein monsters or your Gillman or your, giant bugs in your 50s atomic age movies. We feel for King Kong, we feel for Frankenstein's monster, but we really get to know the werewolf because the werewolf also has their human counterpart. So that's the difference, I think. It's interesting, like, when you watch something like Return of the Vampire from earlier with Lugosi, and you have the Andreas character who's a werewolf, and he speaks. Like, he talks, and that's really engaging because it's like, wow, you never get to see that. Like when, they're in their transitional period of being a werewolf, they never speak. They're howling and grunting and growling, but this guy speaks. So you get to know him even more because in his lycanthropic form, you get to know what he's feeling and how Lugosi's character is so mean to him, etc. But he's oppressor. But the Curse of the Werewolf gives you that really classic example of a man trying to do good who's born with this curse on him, this heavy burden of this curse. But then when he finally, has to be this creature, this werewolf. There's nothing sort of to turn back. Like, he can't turn back. There's nothing that kind of can redeem him besides being killed. And that's something that's really tragic about the werewolf mythology. And, that's reprised much later in something like, American Werewolf in London, where once he's become this werewolf that's killed, there's really no turning back. And that has a tragic ending, albeit a very quick one, him being gunned down in the alleyway. But that film's cool because it has Jenny Agutter referring to this one.
Oliver Reed,
And it's kind of it's kind of like a cultural thing, because he's like, have you seen The Wolf Man? And she's like, is that the one with Oliver Reed? So it's like she's talking about the British film, and David Kess, of course, talking about the American, The Wolf Man. But yeah, it's such a fun film, and it's a beautiful film, and aesthetically it's gorgeous. I think it's like the peak of how Hammer starts to really find their visual style, especially with their period pieces. But this one, and I think Brides of Dracula, are two of my favorite Hammers. And two of my favorite Hammers without your Christopher Lee's and your Peter Cushing. Oh, Peter Cushing's in Bride, sorry. But yeah, those kind of really beautiful, aesthetically gorgeous films, but also really interesting takes on story. And actually, Brides of Dracula is my favorite Hammer film without Dracula. A vampire film without Dracula. But yeah, just really good stuff. But Curse just has this really strong interest, and the cast are amazing, all the supporting cast. But yeah, no, it's one of those ones that always resonates. And being someone who loves werewolf movies, it's definitely up there with one of my favorites, and definitely one of my go-tos.
Yeah. Well, one point I did want to bring up, so you mentioned this kind of perverse fairy tale quality the film has. One thing I think was kind of fascinating, did you ever see Disney's 2017 version of Beauty and the Beast, the Bill Condon remake, the live action one?
I did, yeah.
What's fascinating is there's an opening prologue where they reframe, the prince. He's this kind of rude, spoiled aristocrat, not unlike the Marquis in Curse of the Werewolf. And it shows how he gets cursed, and it's this beautiful kind of French period piece. And I do wonder if Bill Condon was directly influenced by the structure of Curse of the Werewolf, because to me, the parallels were there.
Well, Condon's a monster guy. Gods and Monsters, he worked on that, so he loves his horror stuff. So quite possibly, absolutely, quite possibly, yeah. And the Beauty and the Beast mythology, it's another transformation story, like regardless of what version. So yeah, definitely, possibly,
maybe. But it's also that this is what I was going to actually mention earlier. So you've talked about all the other werewolf variations in the 50s and 60s. Now, if you look at Hammer's major franchises, we had, almost a dozen Draculas, half a dozen Frankensteins, a few mummies here and there. How did Curse of the Werewolf do at the box office? Because this was one and done. So what was the reception like at the time?
I think the reception was it was split. There were people who were big fans of it, then critics that savaged it, and people sort of thought of it as a bit of a, because it sort of had that kind of panto style, the pantomime sort of style, that kind of broad style. They kind of criticized the performances. They thought it was a little bit like too much like a picture book, and also its darkness. It's sort of sort of grotesque or undesirable themes that it had peppered throughout it. This film featured rape. This film featured S&M and stuff like that, like this kind of perversion that was sort of, especially in the opening sequences, like the Marquis is like this, insane character. So it had heavy censorship issues, and even though it was coming out right at the end of that kind of code, it still was sort of suffering at that, and I think it was too grim. And also, I think the werewolf thing just didn't translate well. I think people were kind of more interested in more Dracula and more Frankenstein because it had more of a literary anchoring, whereas like the werewolf mythology was kind of lost in the air. You've got certain books that were published here and there, but it didn't have the same kind of gravity the same kind of gravity pull that Dracula or Frankenstein had, which has such major literary real estate, in film adaptations. So I think that was the main thing. And then because you don't really get another werewolf Hammer film. Whereas, you know, Dracula becomes popular. Also, I guess possibly to do with like, how do you keep up the designs? How do you keep up the transformation stuff? You know, it's expensive, and you can't just stick to the dissolve thing. Things are going to gradually change, and you know, by the time we get to the 70s and into the 80s, we end up having, you know, a lot of bladder work and a lot, you know, a wet dream for any makeup artist to try and design a, you know, a fully functioning transitional werewolf. So prior to that, you know, yeah, they probably thought it was probably too much to sort of work on to make it effective, and audiences were getting a bit savvy and a bit sophisticated. Plus, I think vampires do really well for Hammer because they're hot. There's all these beautiful women like your Ingrid Pitts and your Madeline Smiths, etc. You know, these beautiful goddess women who, you know, can play off the vampire thing beautifully. You can sell the sex appeal of a vampire, probably not so much werewolves.
Yeah. Well, Lee, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Is there anything else that you're working on right now you want the audience to know about?
What am I working on? Just a couple of commentary gigs. I'm producing a couple of features for some stuff coming out for Shout Factory and Arrow. But yeah, I just wrapped up my book on Carrie, so that's out now. There's an oral history of Carrie. But yeah, just plugging along, just keeping busy.
Awesome. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks again. And for you in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.